Today on Face the Nation, presidential candidate Wesley Clark. 3 more U.S. soldiers were killed in Iraq today, bringing to 185 the number of Americans killed there after major combat ended. What would Democratic candidate Clark do to end the guerrilla war? Where does he stand on Medicare, gay marriage, and frontrunner Howard Dean? We'll ask him. Then we'll talk with Walter Cronkite about that day 40 years ago this weekend when President Kennedy was shot. Amy Walter of the Cook Political Report will join in the questioning, and I'll have a final word on Michael Jackson. But first, General Wesley Clark on Face the Nation.
Face the Nation with CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent Bob Schieffer. And now from CBS News in Washington, Bob Schieffer.
Good morning again. General Clark is in Chicago this morning. Good morning, General. Thank you for coming. Good morning, Joining Bob. In our questioning this morning is Amy Walter of the Cook Political Report. General, this week the Republican National Committee began running ads out in Iowa that show the president warning that terrorists could slip a canister of chemical weapons into this country and cause untold horrors that we have never known. The ads go on to say people are attacking the president for attacking the terrorists. It's my understanding that you take some exception to these ads. What's wrong with them?
Well, I think the ads violate the pledge the president made not to exploit 9/11 for political purposes. I think it really strikes at the heart of a democracy when you accuse your opponents of somehow aiding the enemy, and that's what these ads are implying. This is a party that essentially took the 2000 election through the Supreme Court. It's not going to take patriotism away from people in this country. Bob, we're a democracy, and people have a right and a duty to speak out and offer their opinions, and this is going to be an election, and our president should be held accountable. And as far as the specific language in the ads is concerned, it's exactly wrong. I'm not attacking the president because he's attacking terrorists. I'm attacking him because he's not attacking terrorists. He deliberately took us into Iraq, which is not where the terrorists were. He pulled off in Afghanistan. He said Osama bin Laden, dead or alive. He went after Saddam Hussein instead. He hasn't put the effort into Homeland Security. That's a second thought. It's been an afterthought for this administration. So I think the ads are blatantly political. They're wrong. They're misleading. And I hope the American people will see through it. I call on them to take those ads off. If they stand by their word, the RNC ought to pull those ads right back. They don't belong in the American political dialogue.
Amy?
Yes, well, General Clark, certainly Democrats have been attacking the president pretty consistently on his handling of Iraq. Don't you think it's appropriate, as he's being attacked by Democrats, that his party comes up and defends him?
I think it's fine to defend the policy. I think the policy is pretty much indefensible if you look at the facts of it. But that ad's not intended to defend the policy. It's intended to impugn the patriotism of the people who are attempting to represent the will of the electorate and hold the president accountable. That's our process. We don't suspend democracy in this country because we're in a war in Iraq. We shouldn't, we never have, and we're not going to now. Those ads are fundamentally anti-democratic, and that's with a little d, Amy.
General, I understand that you also take exception to the president's policy of not allowing news coverage of the coffins that are coming back to this country from Iraq. Explain to me why you think that's not a good idea.
Bob, I do take exception to it. I think it's a blatantly political move by an administration that's trying to cover up the sacrifices and heroism of the men and women who are serving and sacrificing in Iraq. In 1995, Richard Holbrooke and I and our delegation were trying to bring peace to the Balkans, and we had 3 members of our delegation killed. And Richard Holbrooke and I flew back on the planes, and we escorted those bodies. We were there when we brought them to Dover. We honored them when we came through Dover. That's something the American people expect. We should honor the people who have served and sacrificed, especially in the armed forces, in pursuit of this government's policy. This government doesn't want to recognize their sacrifices that way because it's afraid that it will, quote, undercut public resolve. But let me tell you something. The public will be resolved to do what's ever necessary to follow through on a strategy for success that has meaning and has a chance of succeeding. The real problem this administration has is it doesn't have a strategy for success in Iraq. It hasn't had one from the beginning. It never planned on what to do after the war was over, and it still doesn't have one. And instead, it's trying to dishonor the very Americans who are over there serving and fighting and dying to carry it out by not letting us welcome the remains back home. I think it's wrong.
You have been very critical of the Pentagon leadership, of the White House leadership from the beginning of this war, anyway. But it caused me to look back at some of the things you've said in the past, General, and I want to read you one of them. In December of 2000, you told Matt Lauer on the Today Show what you thought of the president's selection of Don Rumsfeld to be Secretary of Defense, and here's what you said. I think it's an inspired choice. He's got great experience. He's got great international stature. He knows the issues. He's coming into familiar territory. Then last week, Dan Rather asked you if you would fire Rumsfeld, and here's what you said last week.
If I were president, I wouldn't have appointed Don Rumsfeld. I wouldn't have picked him to be the Secretary of Defense because I worked around him. I knew what it was and what the system was, and he wasn't up to speed on the way the world had changed since the end of the Cold War.
Now, General, that's exactly the opposite of what you said in 2000. How do you explain that?
Because as you watch what Don Rumsfeld has done since then, as I think back to where I was then, Don Rumsfeld was appointed, Bob, to block Colin Powell. He was a teammate of Dick Cheney. There had been a long-standing effort and concern, a disagreement between those two, and Don Rumsfeld was part of the Cheney team. He did have a lot of experience, and I knew him at the time, but I also knew at the time that there were things he didn't know, and he hadn't been involved in our work in Bosnia and the Balkans. And had I interviewed him, and had I sat down with him as President of the United States, I would have seen that he really didn't appreciate what we'd gone through in the 1990s in international affairs. He was still back in the Cold War. He was experienced. He'd done a study on national missile defense, but he hadn't understood that the world had changed. The relentless growth of Soviet military power was over. We were dealing with a much less structured international environment. And you can't solve problems in this environment by simply attacking states, and that's what Don Rumsfeld has taken us to.
Wouldn't it be fair for your critics to say, this general just says what appears to be expedient at the moment. He just says whatever the situation seems to call for, because this is an absolute reversal of what you said. It's not just a little change. It's an absolute reversal.
No, I don't think it's fair for critics to say that, because I think if you're sitting down as President of the United States and picking people, you're going to have a chance to go through and really get to know them. And I never had a chance to do that with Don Rumsfeld, but what I've seen since then convinces me that had I gone through there, I would have been able to detect that. Let me give you an example. I went to see Secretary Rumsfeld right after 9/11, and as he explained to me, he'd read my book on Kosovo, and he said, you know, we've learned our lessons. We'll never let anyone tell us where we can or can't bomb again. Had we had that discussion before, I would have considered him to be Secretary of Defense. I couldn't have appointed him, because the principal lesson of Kosovo is that if you work with allies and if you work within international law, you can achieve strategically decisive results without using necessarily decisive force. That's what we did in Kosovo. That's what Don Rumsfeld failed to do, and George Bush in Iraq.
Well, I bring this up because, as you well know, in sort of a famous episode in the early days of your campaign, you told some reporters that you probably would have voted to authorize military action against Iraq. Later, you said you would not have done that. And you said, well, it's in the beginning stages of the campaign. And last week, then, you told Dan Rather a new reason for that. You said, I wasn't clear if the discussion was on or off the record. I would have to ask you, what is the difference? Are there some things that you believe off the record that you would not say publicly?
No, but it's a complicated series of discussions. And I was with a very able team of reporters, and one very able reporter who quickly sized this up as the key issue in the campaign. I just mishandled a question when I should have done it better. But let me explain.
Well, I mean, shouldn't you, if you really meant that you were going to vote against it, shouldn't you have said off the record, look, I'm against it?
I did say that off the record. I did say, here's what I said, Bob, and let me try to go through this and reconstruct my thoughts on this. I don't have a transcript of what I actually said to the reporter, so I may be off by
well, they have transcripts.
They do, but let me go through why I said what I said and what I mean by this. I always believed that Saddam Hussein was a challenge to the international situation, and particularly to the United Nations Security Council, because if you allow someone to skate through without following through on UN Security Council resolutions, you do invalidate the significance of the United Nations. So I would have supported efforts to leverage the problem and get it back to the United Nations in an appropriate way. I never believed Saddam Hussein was a reason to go to war. There was not an imminent threat there, and I'm very consistent on that. I was one of the guys who was responsible for patrolling the skies over Iraq. I saw a lot of the intelligence, probably didn't see all of it, but I never saw anything that would have convinced me that he was an imminent threat. I couldn't be certain of this, the way the administration was talking, because they were holding their cards pretty close, but I just never saw any evidence that he was an imminent threat. So when you put these two together, Bob, if I could just finish, please. Sure. If you put these two together, here's what you have. You have a situation where, on the one hand, we should be focused in the war on terror, and that should have been the 100% focus of the United States of America. Then this administration comes back and says, well, we got to do something about Iraq because there's a threat. Okay, so what I'm saying is, okay, I wouldn't have done that strategically, but if you insist on doing something about Iraq, I would support taking it to the United Nations. I would not support opening a second front in Iraq when we haven't gotten Osama bin Laden and cleaned up the situation in Afghanistan. And that's been my basic position. It's been consistent. I've written it, said it in tens of thousands of words for the last 2 years.
All right. Well, let's move on to domestic policies for a moment here. And certainly one of the biggest political stories this week was the Supreme Court decision, Massachusetts Supreme Court decision on gay marriage. Now, there's a lot of talk in Congress about bringing up a constitutional amendment that would ban same-sex marriage. What's your position on that issue?
Well, I'm not in favor of a constitutional amendment. I do believe that people should have equal rights in this country, and I don't believe we should be discriminating against people on the basis of their sexual orientation. So I welcome the decision of the Massachusetts Supreme Court. I think the state legislatures need to take a look at it. Obviously, the Massachusetts legislature is first on this, and we should listen to the legislature.
So do you think then same-sex couples have the right to be married?
I think they should have the right to civil unions. I think they should have the rights to joint domicile, to cover each other by their medical insurance, to have the rights of survivorship. In other words, the way I look at it, Amy, is this, and I've talked to a lot of my Army friends about it. And the Army has been, and the Armed Forces have been, one of the institutions where there has been a lot of concern about this. But think of it this way: if you had a child who was gay, would you love them? And everybody says yes. And then you say, well, because they're gay, would you want them to be discriminated against? Or would you want them to have the same rights as every other person in America? And I think if you phrase the issue that way, I think most Americans will say they want them to have the same rights as everybody else in America. You don't want your children discriminated against, and these are our children. That's all.
Well, certainly this is being discussed now in political circles as being a wedge issue in this campaign. And when you look at some of the regions where Democrats have traditionally struggled, especially on some of these cultural issues like the South, you see overwhelming opposition, even to the idea of the civil union. How do Democrats go about, and you go about, talking to these voters? And do you see that this issue becomes the wedge in this campaign?
Well, I hope it doesn't become a wedge. I know it will be the strategy of the other party to make it a wedge, because the other party would rather talk about issues like this than the failure of that party to effectively lead the country. But I think if people realize it in human terms, and there are many, many people in America who have children who are gay, and they know it, and they have had to face this question, and they love their children, and they want them to be treated equally. And that doesn't matter whether you're from the South or the North or the East or the West. It's just the fact that we love our children and we want them to be treated equally and well. And I think that's an issue that shouldn't divide America. I think that's an issue that should bring America together. We're a nation that stands for equal treatment under law of every person in America, period. And that's what we should be proud of. We should be proud to uphold it. We should uphold it under the American flag, and it should bring us together as a nation.
General, I heard you say you favor civil unions. Do you favor marriage, gay marriage?
I think that's an issue both for the churches and synagogues and others to consider, and the state legislatures. So what I believe we have to do is we have to have protection under law, with the same rights under law. Whether a church wants to recognize it as a marriage, whether a state government wants to say that this can be called a, quote, marriage or not, well, those are terms that the governments and the churches should use. But in terms of equal protection under law, I think the case is clear, and that's why I welcome the decision of the state Supreme Court of Massachusetts.
Sure. Well, let's move on to talk a little about tactics of the campaign here. Howard Dean is ahead pretty strongly in New Hampshire. You've decided not to compete in Iowa. Howard Dean is always considered the front runner in most places. How do you go about beating Howard Dean for the nomination?
Well, I think it's mostly a matter of ideas and recognizing where the country's headed. There's a lot of anger in this country about George Bush and the Republican Party. President Bush ran as a compassionate conservative. He proved instead to be reckless and getting us into Iraq, and radical in terms of his social policies in the United States, and people are outraged by that as well as by the 2000 election, and Governor Dean has been very effective at exploiting the anger that's out there residual. But I'm not running to bash George Bush. A lot of Americans really love him. They love what he represents, a man who's overcome adversity in his life from alcoholism and pulled his marriage back together and moved forward. But I'm running because I think this country must have better leadership in moving forward. We're moving into a time of enormous crisis in America. A crisis first that we see shaping up abroad. Al-Qaeda has not been finished. Instead, it's intensifying its grip in places like Turkey, as we've seen by the last week. And we have not effectively pursued the remnants of Al-Qaeda. We don't even know really how they're communicating now. We're just assuming, since we're not picking up any electronic emissions, that Osama bin Laden is less relevant. I think that's a dangerous assumption. And if Newsweek magazine, as they apparently did, can find him in the mountains of western Pakistan, I don't know why the United States government can't. I've called on the United States to join with the Saudis and go after Osama bin Laden. And at home, Bob, if you consider where we are right now, we've still got 8.8 million people unemployed in this country.
General, I'm sorry, we're out of time. Thank you so much. Hope to see you again.
Thank you
Back
very
in a
much.
minute. There have been memorials and special reports all week, but as I thought back on the death of John Kennedy, the man I most wanted to hear from this week was my friend Walter Cronkite, who broke that terrible news to so many Americans in that brief announcement that has become so much a part of our history.
President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the hospital.
40 years later, Walter Cronkite says of all the stories he told us about, that one hit him hardest personally.
But when I had to say that he was dead, suddenly the immensity of the story came to me. I was fighting back the tears. I think just one or two tears appeared, but I had to take my glasses off to brush the tear away so I could see what I was doing. And it was tough.
I was at the other end of the story that day, a young newspaper reporter at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. When Lee Harvey Oswald's mother inexplicably called our newspaper looking for a ride after hearing of her son's arrest, I drove her to the Dallas police station. From New York to Dallas, it was bedlam.
We, of course, were not thinking in those days of the kind of terrorist activity that we would certainly jump at today if such a thing happened. We didn't think of terror strikes of that nature. We hadn't had any, wasn't any such beast out there.
It was the height of the Cold War, and at first we feared it was a prelude to a Soviet attack. The borders with Mexico were closed, and American bombers went on alert. In time, authorities would say it was the work of a malcontent, but there were so many questions we couldn't be sure. All we knew was that a great sadness had settled over the land, and we all grieved together around our televisions.
Do you think that television sort of held the country together that weekend?
Oh, yes. We were all concentrating on the same subject at the same time. 3-4 days, the assassination, and then the lying in state at the Capitol, and then the funeral cortege passing through the streets of Washington. And some of those powerful pictures that we had. But when that picture came up of John saluting, gosh, I still almost puddle up when I think of that picture.
Do you accept the Warren Commission findings that Oswald was the lone gunman?
The one thing that makes me believe now that the Warren Commission was right is that you and I know from as newsmen that there is nothing so hard to keep as a secret with a conspiracy of that kind. It seems to me somebody would have leaked it.
What do you think Kennedy's legacy will be? Because he wasn't there for a very long time.
I think his legacy will almost solely be, quite honestly, his handling of the missile crisis. That he saved us from war will be the general opinion of the historians, I think, as it would be the fact. And that will be almost the sole achievement of the Kennedy years.
Walter, will you ever forget that weekend?
Never.
Nor will any of us who lived through that awful day. I'll be back with a final word in just a minute. And finally today, I see they have arrested Michael Jackson. Fine, give him a fair trial and let me know how it comes out. Spare me the details between now and then. I guess I'm going to have to admit something here. Up front, I am biased. I think Michael Jackson is a creep. I don't want to know anything else about him, about his plastic surgery, about his unhappy childhood, or about his friends. I don't want to know. I don't need to know anything else about him. Just tell me when the jury finds him innocent or guilty. There is no way, this is in no way meant as criticism of the news broadcasts and cable shows that have given his arrest such heavy coverage. When a guy as rich as Michael Jackson goes on trial, you have to keep the pressure on by keeping it in the public eye. When such things don't get public attention, it's too easy for somebody to buy off somebody. But the heavy coverage brings an added advantage for us. We don't have to cover it here. So when and if you feel the need to find out more about this case, use the clicker. I guarantee that on some channel at any hour of the night or day, you can get the latest. In the meantime, Face the Nation is going to stick to Iraq in the coming election and some even duller stuff. We're going to pass on the Jackson story. Sorry, but it just makes me sick at my stomach. That's it for us. We'll see you next week right here on Face the Nation.